Tell us about the concept and the purpose of the annual Rural Development Conference that's to be taking place soon.
The conference occurs in a broader context of a broad and wide search for rural development models in South Africa. The conference is a public dialogue. Stakeholders, rural development stakeholders from civil society, from government, from higher education, traditional leadership, private sector, gather annually every September in Mthatha. They identify and challenge. They identify and analyze challenges facing rural development primarily. And the commissions of the conference then work together to come up with proposals for interventions, in order to bring about integrated, sustainable rural development.
Okay, you say this conference happens annually, and many people say, okay, enough with the talking. What solutions have been identified, and what implementation, what material benefits come out of a situation like this?
Maybe one should understand the broad aim of the conference. We are higher education, and we aim at ensuring that South Africa, especially government, they begin to, thinking and planning of rural development interventions that is research-based, that is knowledge-based. And in terms of what the conference has achieved, I would say that if you look at the progress made, the conference has had discussions that have brought about real concrete results. For example, we now have a Ministry of Rural Development. And the discussion about, the earlier discussions about that ministry took place in the conference. Professor Mayende, 3 years ago, presented a paper on a developmental state, and his paper called on a very loud call on a Ministry for Rural Development.
Okay, the theme this year is preconditions for successful implementation of rural development strategies in South Africa. What have been identified as key inputs that are needed in order to get successful reform of the agrarian economies in South Africa? When you go to government with submissions and conclusions from this kind of a conference, what do you say?
Let me make reference to an international conference that took place in New Delhi earlier on this year. The focus and emphasis was on new paradigms, that there is need for new paradigms in rural development in order to bring about visible change. And this particular conference has identified capacity building, and that is why one of the items on the agenda is empowerment and capacity building of rural communities as a precondition. In fact, the conference, the international conference in New Delhi, took a resolution that the key element of rural development is empowerment. And this was based on studies about developments in China as well as in Brazil.
Okay. Let's bring in Lumkile Mondi into the conversation. About 60% of our society either live in rural areas or in peri-urban communities. Now, if you look at other economies in the world where there's a situation like that, they create cottage industries around there, as opposed to centering development in the urban areas, forcing an exodus out of the rural areas. What do we do getting people to stay in rural areas and to empower them to be economically self-sufficient in their farming activities, but to have access to markets close by?
Well, I mean, I still fail to understand how can South Africa's economic development be different from the developed countries. I think it was Lenin who said that the first world economies reflect where developing economies should be in some future. So the migration from rural areas to urban areas defines the level of development, because what attracts us, I'm from Mount Frere, and what attracted my father to come to Johannesburg was because the wages was better, the conditions of employment were better, and it had access to much better opportunities than rural areas. And hence in South Africa, there's been a huge underinvestment in the rural areas, partly because a lot of our land is not arable. Secondly, the state has never delivered in terms of supporting rural household in terms of inputs, such as seeds or fertilizer. So really, in South Africa, historically, we're far behind in terms of what the Indians have done or what the Brazilians have done in terms of doing that. So I don't see any model or any strategy. I think South Africa, there's a lot of talk about it, and a lot of these communities are marginalized anyway, except for a few that are in very fertile land in Mpumalanga, KZN, but the rest of the country, I see people that have just trapped, and they may do the wise thing like my family did, to pack for the city and try and fight for survival there.
Professor, you want to respond to that?
Well, I would say I come from Higher Education Center for Rural Development, and one is looking at how government comes up with these strategies. The current strategy is the Comprehensive Rural Development Program, and is being piloted in Mwesha, in Mhlonhlo. But because the very idea of piloting originated from this conference and was started in Mhlonhlo by the university, we've been critical of the way in which government steps in and put the idea of service delivery at the forefront, as opposed to innovative ideas that take the knowledge base of the rural people themselves into account. Because one of the key notions in the world today is about investing in people. And investing in people is about mainstreaming also of indigenous knowledge. And this will feature largely in the conference.
Investing of a different kind, Lumkile Mondi, you come from the IDC, and you've been identified as the IDC as one of the key development finance institutions to drive a lot of the innovations needed in the SME sector, in the rural development sector. Challenge for rural communities and farming activities is funding. Often banks are only prepared to fund the acquisition of land, which can later be used as collateral. But what we've seen in countries like Malawi, it's not just the land that's important, it's the farming inputs that you refer to. It's the fertilizer subsidies, if it's possible for a government to move in that direction. It's setting up marketing boards for grains that can be traded, and creating the necessary infrastructure to make it successful. Is enough being done?
Not enough, because we've taken a view that we are pursuing an industrialization strategy. The IDC is more about industrial development than rural development. So the intervention that takes place at rural level is more about high value added agricultural products. I'm talking about cashew nuts, about table grapes, etc. Some of which the majority of our people in the rural areas don't even enjoy, because they cannot afford, they don't have a source of income for them to buy those goods. So therefore, you know, for land and rural development, there's an institution called Land Bank whose focus is that. For us, we're driving an urbanization strategy and an innovation strategy of putting South Africa as a world-class manufacturer to compete with the Brazil, with the England,
beyond the land bank, what more needs to be done? We know of some of the problems that have occurred in the administration of the land bank. Other development financing institutions are needed to fast-track rural development.
Not really. I think we need government which is elected by people to do what's supposed to do, to carry on the mandate of the people and implement it. There's institutions here, a professor is talking about her institution that are involved in empowering people. So government probably shouldn't be the one as being a delivery vehicle. It's to work in partnership with institutions like hers and communities to see how to indigenize, how to bring back and empower people to find their local solutions. However, they cannot make decisions for those communities. They need partners to do that. And in this case, I think South Africa is very, very clear to me, want a high-wage economy, because with the high-wage economy, people are more mobile, not only locally, but globally, and that's why for the movement to the cities.
Professor, final question, partnerships that the Center for Rural Development, through this conference, could try to engender some of the keynote speakers at this conference? Who can we look forward to hearing from, and what sort of relationships are built from this sort of situation?
Talking about India and China, we've been using this conference to expose stakeholders from government right down to communities to alternative models, to success stories in the world. And one of the models that were found quite striking is the Punjab model, which brought about the Green Revolution in India. Of course, there are problems with the Green, some contradictions with the Green Revolution as well. But the basic principle is that we would think that these models, can be, one can learn from these models. So we are bringing in this year not just the minister who will be at the conference to speak about the Comprehensive Rural Development Program, but our keynote speaker will be the Vice Chancellor of the Punjab Agricultural University. The reason being that we know, or we hear, that the Punjab in India, it's a province like the Eastern Cape, was poorer than the Eastern Cape, for example, about 50 years ago, and today is India's food basket. So we are interested in establishing how did that happen. So one then can expect speakers on indigenous knowledge systems, for example, from the Department of Science and Technology,